everybody to our final Environmental Humanities public lecture for this academic year, but not our final event. In fact, our final event is a conference which is taking place in Bristol on June the 6th and 7th and 8th. This is Nancy Jones, who is a co-organiser of the conference. It's called Marine Transgressions. And we'll find it on the internet. So it's Environmental Humanities, Arts and Humanities Perspectives on the Ocean. And Alex Campbell, who is also here, is doing some really cool public engagement events connected with it at the Bristol Aquarium.
Yeah, next Wednesday and next weekend.
Indeed, absolutely. So check out Marine Transgressions. And we're really thrilled because it's a collaboration initiated and carried forward by PhD students at Bristol and Bath Spa. So a lovely bridge building exercise between the two universities. So I'm really delighted we have a double act tonight. Erin Kavanagh and Iain Diggs, and I have to get my little sheet notes up here. Sorry, Erin. Erin's a poet, photographer, artist, archaeologist, and academic. So, you know, we specialise in interdisciplinarity, and Erin rather embodies it. So it's really great to have you here. And her work is, as I said, very interdisciplinary. And in 2005, she created a deep mapping project called Layers in the Landscape, which brings many disciplines into conversation. And has also led to a project, what's a POC?
Proof of concept.
Okay, proof of concept, to employ poetry as an archaeological method for engagement. And you have something that's going to press imminently.
Yes.
Are you not? Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, that was assure me. It's gone to press as of my illustrative chaos this morning. Yes, we've got a book out called Remapping Archaeology, in which there's a section on layers of the landscape and how to reframe Christmas Lucas's deep mapping for the modern interdisciplinary academic space. It's got that one coming out, and there's another one out later this year for archaeology as method. And this as well. Hopefully, if we work out how to. We're supposed to be putting this in print. You will understand by the end of this presentation why that's proving a little tricky.
And Iain, I'm delighted to say, has just come on staff as a visiting scholar of the Research Centre for Environmental Humanities, so we can now claim a little piece of Iain, which is very nice. Iain is also very interdisciplinary. He's a poet and photographer, artist, and so that's you, isn't it, Erin? Sorry, he's an artist. He's an artist. He's an artist, a researcher, and writer, based in Bristol, and has a long-term association with various universities, particularly UE and Glasgow, Dundee. I knew it was Scottish. Dundee. Sorry. And Iain has been working with Owen, who's Deputy Director of the Centre. For those who don't know me, I'm Director of the Research Centre for Environmental Humanities. Owen's Deputy Director, and he's Principal Investigator on a big project called Towards Hydro Citizenship, which is about using the arts to connect people with their local waterways and waters, coasts and rivers and estuaries and such like. So Iain has been working with Owen on Towards Hydro Citizenship. And he's been exploring lost vernacular, quasi-animist traditions through site-specific work in the English-Scottish borders for many years. And the title of this presentation is Crow Road. Take it away. Thank you.
On the Crow Road, there's a river of sound that sails from thought to memory, a prophecy of provision, guiding battles through the flood.
Once upon a time, a tale was told to me of a road lined with echoes on which a song is sung by crows on the outside reach of hearing, playing to the tide.
There's something about crows that draws me to them. The difficulty is that it's hard to tell the crows I discover through observation from those we create, the conception of the crow from the crow's living image. The following lines by Robert Hunter from his and Jerry Garcia's 1969 song Uncle John's Band tap into an old folk motif that crossed the Atlantic like so many others. It's the same story the crow told me, it's the only one he knows. Like the morning sun you come, and like the wind you go.
And like the wind we go, chasing melodies, dancing in notation.
Many years ago, I borrowed an old Orkney story for a project called 8 Lost Songs. I retold it as follows. A young girl went out to play one day with her friends. After a while, they got bored with all their usual games and wondered what to do. The girl child, daughter to the howdy Matty Finn, said, "I'll show you something my mam taught me." She stood on the great stone at the field's edge, flapped her thin arms, and turned into a great black crow that flew low over the heads of the other children, inviting them to catch it. Surprised but delighted, they ran laughing and calling after the crow until they were tired out. The crow returned to the great stone and began to change back into a little girl. But the children soon realised something was wrong. What hopped and shook on the stone was a young girl with the head of a great black crow. They became frightened and, after whispering together, sent the youngest of the group to find Matty Finn. Matty was standing at her doorway talking to a sea captain. On the islands, the Howdies, or Finns, wise women who gained their power from the fairy folk, were believed to be able to summon up fair or foul winds. They could be persuaded to sell a fair wind for good silver. Matty gave the poor child a black look when she interrupted them, but when she heard what had happened, ran straight out to the pasture. Coming up to her daughter, hopping and crying on the great stone, she called out some words, and at once the crow child had her own head again. Matty took her by the shoulder and gave her daughter a good hard slap, saying, "That'll learn you not to forget what you've been taught." As I finished drafting this version of the old story, an email arrived from the artist Ruth Jones, who I'd worked with briefly in Belfast some years before but had not seen since. Attached was this image. I've been haunted by crows ever since.
Haunted by an absence, pecking at words we hide behind a masquerade, seeking the lonely mountain ways, our tale the fringe of forgetting.
On the Crow Road, there is a myth that has no name, but everybody knows, a girl and a bird, weaving magic out of the earth.
I am made of nothing, the crow said. When night tires, it sheds a void of down into hungry trees, the shrapnel of dreams catching on branches, where nothingness settles and becomes fragmented, flying on borrowed wings. I carry this darkness upon my back, and my eye is broad of vision to see the footprints left behind and the secrets sunshine tries to hide. My nest to the margin, I hear the curses from centuries gone and the muttering of madmen in the breeze. The crow turned on her shoulder, as if expecting somebody else to speak. She noted how his eyes wrapped a crowd, reflecting things she only wished were there. His beak as straight as the road he took, cloaked in a coal-sheen skin, and brighter than a midnight pyre.
On the Crow Road, there is a girl with feathers in her hair. She dreams of friends and firesides, and when she flies, revelations rain in half notes, guiding waymakers through the door.
Gaston Bachelard wrote that it might even be a good idea to stir up competition between conceptual and imaginative activity. In any case, All efforts to make them cooperate are doomed to disappointment. The image can never give matter to the concept. The concept, by giving stability to the image, would stifle its existence. I see Bachelard's productive competition as linked to John Wiley's claim that landscape is tension. I hear that observation as gesturing to the same sense of fullness evoked by the lines spoken by the girl in Erin's poem.
I am made of thinking, the girl replied. When other minds stop at the boundary of their way, I rise a little higher to view the wall from the other side. Sometimes I rest upon its head, watching other travellers turning past, frightened, obedient to the grey edges of their cage.
It's one of the deep tensions that keep us off balance, that remind us that the boundaries between categories join just as much as they separate.
I too have learned how to follow pathways of the sky and to see with my eyes tight closed. I have learned to listen to the speakers who have no sound and to read the weather in a pattern of cattle who do not lie like sentences. The girl paused.
My father shared the hatred of crows that's almost universal among upland sheep farmers. Even after he'd announced to the family that he was too blind to drive safely, my half-brother still caught him trying to shoot hoodie crows out of his bedroom window. One wet, wild autumn day, walking in the hills above his house, I stumbled upon an old ewe, dying. She was haunted by the pair of crows who had already taken out one of her eyes. So, one part of me knew from that shocking experience that, in the eyes of the farmer, that hatred was entirely justified.
As if unaccustomed to being heard, the crow noted that she was sat on stone, which may once have cut a glen in two. Her clothes were those from an earlier weft, and her hair was longer than the years she wore.
On the Crow Road, there is a girl with a bird at her side. Together they are still as a tree that leans with the wind, but never falls, marking direction with the turn beneath.
Aged 11 or 12, I knew nothing of Ted Hughes' Crow poems, with their dark trickster challenge to both Christianity and humanism, of the controversies that surrounded him as a person. Nor of our Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin, with its insistence that 2 and 2 equals the wind. The living bird is not its labelled bones. I did, however, know very well that crows have no monopoly on inflicting pain.
I am not blind, the crow agreed, for I have the eyes of every soldier and a long-forgotten flock tell me their woes. Although you may think me cruel, it is a gift I share to go beyond horizons glare.
Perhaps I already suspected that my father's hatred of crows was shot through with unease regarding their uncanniness, their existing on the margin between life and death, and the way that much of their behaviour resembled that of human beings. Crows learn quickly, solve problems, often in cooperation with others of their kind, use tools, and even play. They're also extremely inquisitive. I'd done some John Donne in English at school, and so could begin to understand that, in a culture that had once thought that the eyes were windows to the soul, pecking out those of the dead or dying was never going to win you popularity contests. I knew views about crows vary wildly between different cultures. Yet it's the sense that crows are liminal birds, in some sense justifying their status as psychopomp, responsible for the passage of souls, that haunts me out of a strange childhood that included my father's reports of uncanny events on the Isle of Skye.
The now familiar pair moved on into the hinterlands, collecting those who fell with a dark grace, undertaking the unwanted tasks of men who zigzag around the secret spaces.
Landscapes refuse to be disciplined. They make a mockery of the oppositions that we create between time, history, and space, geography, or between nature, science, and culture, social anthropology. So says Barbara Bender, and for me, Chew Green, high in the Cheviot Hills, perfectly illustrates her point. Albeit that this is just Bender's post-disciplinary perspective as an academic. To better sense the fullness of certain landscapes, we need to extend her observation in quite other terms. The notion I choose is that of kith, now obsolete except in the alliterative expression kith and kin. The Middle English noun kith signified both familiar country, place that one knows, and kinfolk relations. You might say it names the human equivalent to hefting, the system of livestock husbandry based on territorial instincts that enables stock to graze a selected area without the need of fencing. This selected area is known as heft in northern England and is the flock's own territory. Alternative terms include the Welsh caifen, which is largely untranslatable, meaning something like habitat, familiarity, haunt, a place or time in which we feel the greatest sense of belonging, akin to Hareth, which is the longing for such a place, time or experience. Hefting is possible because all wild and feral sheep have a strong female home range tendency, an instinct that has been encouraged in discrete flocks to establish hefting as a management practice. Hefting is then both the name for the group of animals, usually sheep, but also Galloway and High-Level cattle, Welsh mountain, fell and dales ponies, and the area to which they restrict themselves, or are restricted by human management.
Hefty was their burden, unafraid to stand before the edge, rooted in the making of hero.
Kith seems to me to enlarge the notion of hefting and give it a human sense, not unlike Tim Ingvell's taskscape. That is, it describes a relational interdependence, the sense in which land and human beings reciprocally make each other up, a process that generates complex but specific nature cultures. Hefted beings accustomed to learn from and adapt to their environment over generations. They may develop resistance to specific diseases, become more tolerant to mineral deficiencies, either through improved efficiency and absorption or through greater selection of plants and plant parts, and also to avoid toxic or harmful organisms. Agriculturalists have described hefted sheep as having inbuilt or inbred knowledge of where to find natural salt licks, medicinal herbs, and protection from snow and wind. However, the abilities of hefted sheep are inseparable from those of the farmers who live on and care for the land where the sheep live.
Maent yn mynd am dro, potilyn y tewydd yn olwg nefyn, y dychymeg blaenorol.
From this perspective of kith, the Chew Green landscape is, in addition to a subject of history, geography, science and social anthropology, a borders upland landscape co-constituted by a form of hill farming that is only possible because of sophisticated teamwork between hefted sheep that are kith to both shepherds and dogs. So, attempting distinctions here between nature and culture is every bit as difficult as in the Amazon of Eduardo Cohn's How Forests Think.
On the Crow Road, there is a forest of shadows. Some who saw the bird at their cradle, some who heard twa corbies on the mended wall, tidying the ground.
Importantly, this is also both crow country and the heartland of a tradition exemplified by the short medieval ballad Twa Corbies, in English The Two Crows. This ballad reports a conversation between two crows and serves us as a point of departure. In response to one crow's question as to where they will find food, the other answers that the whereabouts of the nearby body of a recently slain knight is known only to his hawk, his hound, and his lady fair. Since the hawk and hound have both gone hunting, and the lady has taken another mate, they are free to feed undisturbed on his corpse. One will sit on his white neck bone, while the other pecks out his pretty blue eyes. They will use a lock of his golden hair to thatch their nest. The song ends,
Many a one for him makes name, but none shall ken where he is gane, or his white veins when they are bare, the wind shall lay for evermore.
The ballad suggests a certain understanding of how crows appeared in medieval Borders culture. Firstly, they were clearly understood to be intelligent birds. They have a wide range of vocalizations, which includes imitating human speech, so it's unsurprising that their conversation is comprehensible to the narrator. Secondly, they were thought to be monogamous for life and to possess supernatural abilities, which here enable them to know and disapprove of the knight's lady having already taken another mate. While today many people will find this ballad gruesome and its ending bleak, to a medieval mind conditioned by Christian moralizing, it would have reflected the belief that, in both their monogamy and their commitment as parents, crows were superior to humans. This is not to say that those hearing the ballad would not have memories of witnessing and being revolted by the crow's capacity to peck out the eyes of corpses. Only that their attitude to crows might have been more complex and ambiguous than our own. The Border ballads are also shot through with spectral traces of pre-Christian beliefs, something also relevant here.
With kith and kin and heft and haw, the spectre of both crow and girl caught at the crossing with a superstitious air.
Those of you who've read Iain Banks's novel The Crow Road will remember that the phrase refers both to a street in the west of Glasgow and to someone's death, as in, he's a while the Crow Road. The association of the crow with death has a long prehistory in Celtic myth that continues to find contemporary expression in songs like the German writer, model and singer Nabal Hex's song Celtic Crows. This relates how, as she walks in Ireland, 3 crows pass her by, and she remembers and calls out their names.
To the queens of war, Nemian, Morgan, Beefcather, 3 crows fly like ghosts from another time.
These crows are the fateful triple goddess, often associated with fate and the foretelling of doom and death in battle. In traditional Celtic folklore, the crow also appears on the shoulder of the dying Cuchulainn, and its uncanny reputation persisted. The hooded crow is associated with the Cid, or fairies, in the Scottish Highlands and Ireland, who are variously said to be the dead ancestors, spirits of nature, or goddesses and gods. This link is stressed in Peter O'Connell's 1819 Irish dictionary, which identifies the barb as a female fairy, phantom, or spectre, who sometimes appears in the form of a crow.
A girl with a beak and the crow with long hair.
It's now more than 15 years since Marina Warner wrote of contemporary fiction that, I quote, "The Christian supernatural, with its terror of pagan concepts of metamorphosis, no longer obtains. Instead, she suggests we are offered, I quote, the growing fallout of such concepts as the subliminal self, with its connections to spirit voyaging, to revenants and teleporting souls, to animism and metempsychosis, to a vision of personal survival through dispersed memory, in life and in death, rather than Freud's unconscious and its hopes for potential individual integration. Increasingly, creative practitioners are stressing connectedness, along with ontological status, predicated on the notion of individuals in community, both human and non-human. Hence our advocacy of returning to the notion of kith. Some writers on art, notably the curator, critic and educator Anselm Frank, have linked this to animism. Marina Warner's observations notwithstanding, we still lack a resonant language with which to re-articulate concepts of metamorphosis in ways that are appropriate to a developing understanding of our ecosophical pluriverse. The Crower's psychopoem may be of help here. Another aspect of neo-animist practices is that ultimately ecosophical engagement with and revalidation of what, in Taoist philosophy, is referred to as the vegetative or animal soul, or the po-soul.
The girl with the beak, the crow with long hair, the mother who watches in streams.
Sharing its Chinese name with the term a lunar phase, the po-soul is associated with the passions and returns its energies to the earth at death. James Hillman identifies psychic life in the veil with this po-soul that slips into the ground. He sees it as requiring that we go deeper into concrete realities to animate them through imagination. This suggests an alternative way of seeing what, in academic criticism, is referred to as the ethnographic term. For example, while Jorma Puranen acknowledges the role of the history of anthropology and photography in the genesis of his project Imaginary Homecoming, he also stresses that it was born of long conversations with Sami people about their land and history. His is a conversational exercise in place-based cultural notitia through testimonial imagination, echoing Hillman's stress on the recognition of history, an archaeology of soul, a digging in ruins, a recollecting.
They are the recollections of childhood, the isolation of recalling, digging in the ruins of your belief.
This investigation led to Puranen's metaphorically returning images of people buried in the archives to the landscape and culture from which they'd been separated. A similar enacting of imaginary homecoming as an attending to, or pondering of po-soul, appears in Marlene Creed's The Distance Between 2 Points is Measured in Memories, Labrador, 1988. Places of presence, Newfoundland kin and ancestral land, Newfoundland, 1989 to 1991. And perhaps most radically in terms of its intimacy with Newfoundland's vegetative ecology, Sleeping Places, Newfoundland, 1982. Crow's insistence on all living things' necessary transitoriness, like the morning sun we come and like the wind we go, is an invitation, not to any kind of refusal of our current state of civilization, but to a staying with its troubles as suggested by Donna Haraway, a commitment in the spirit of the crow to the ambiguous knowing of folk philosophers and tricksters, to curiosity mixed with scepticism, to canniness, and, given the times, to a necessarily morbid humour.
Once upon a time, this tale was told to me from a girl who cast no shadow and a corby with a child's shawl. On the Crow Road, where there is a river of sound that sails from thought to memory, for in the morning sun we come, and like the wind, we go. Thank you.
And our thanks to the co-opted chorus.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Erin and Iain. We're going to move into discussion, but continuing the sort of element of audience participation that we've already had, I've invited another of our visiting scholars, Terry Gifford, to kick off the discussion with a response to the presentation. Terry, many of you, of course, know Terry, but for those who don't, Terry is a pioneering environmental literary scholar, or eco-critic, as we call ourselves, and a renowned poet, and a great asset to our Environmental Humanities Centre. And this is his new collection of poetry. He's the author of many collections of poetry, also published the first critical work on environmental poetry in Britain, Green Voices. So thank you very much, Terry.
Thank you. That was marvellous, thank you. I saw this performance at the ASTI conference last summer in Sheffield, and there's so much to talk about what has been happening here just now, that I wanted to bring the performance here to Bar Spa, and I'm going to raise, I think, 7 I've just been noting down, sort of aspects of some of the things that have been happening here for our discussion. On the 5th of April this year, I abseiled into the nest of ravens in Fairy Cave Quarry in the Mendips, and I plucked out the 4 young, rather overgrown, rather too large young from the nest. They were very reluctant to let go of the wool that was at the centre of the nest, because of course the nest is made in January, the earliest of the spring production. And on the 5th of April they were ready for ringing, and they were hauled up to be ringed. Actually, one of them was ringed by Myra Rose, the 15-year-old birder who gave a talk here, you remember. She's 16 now, she's really getting on, and she's doing her GCSEs. But she's a trainee ringer, and she ringed one of those 4 ravens. I had 3 ringed, there were 3 last year, and 4 the year before that. And I realised that what I'm involved in here is a kind of bit of a scientific kind of study of the ravens in the Mendips. So I recorded the fledging date, which was only three weeks later. And actually last night, when I went into Fairy Cave Quarry to go climbing, all 6 of them circled above me as I entered the quarry, calling, chasing melodies and dancing in notation, I noticed, in their raven way. So it's great, the family is fledged, and the rings, I hope, will contribute to scientific studies of ravens in the Mendips, which suddenly brought to mind the way in which, in my education, science was something that you chose at the age of 16 or perhaps 14, and you went into the Science 6 or the Art 6, and our 2 cultures education system came into play. And I think one of the things that has been happening here, hasn't it, has been about boundaries actually joining as much as they separate, as Iain put it. And so that's something I'm interested in, to what extent those kind of boundaries really still exist and are being broken by what we've been experiencing here. Incidentally, the call of the raven that I heard last night, those chasing melodies, is described by our colleague Stephen Moss in his new book about bird names as giving the name to the crow, crow. And he says, next time you hear the croaking call of the raven, remember that the name we use for this huge and fearsome corvid is not all that different from what our prehistoric ancestors might have called it. A fantastic connection through just a single name, the crow, or the raven, Corvid corax. And this afternoon, I've been working on an essay about Ted Hughes and the environmental humanities, which has been focusing on his changing attitude towards science. And I came across him saying this. In 1970, the year of publication of Crow, in an essay called Myth and Education, our school syllabus, of course, is one outcome of 300 years of rational enlightenment, which have begun by questioning superstitions, and ended by prohibiting imagination itself as a reliable mental faculty, branding it more or less as a criminal in a scientific society, reducing the Bible to a bundle of old women's tales, finally murdering God. And what this has ended in is a completely passive attitude of apathy in the face of material facts. The scientific attitude, which is the crystallization of the rational attitude, has to be passive in face of the facts if it's to record the facts accurately. The result is something resembling mental paralysis. Well, I wonder to what extent that is still true, and to what extent the boundaries broken here have been breaking a mental paralysis. I also want to raise a question about what was happening when Iain starts saying, as I finished drafting a version of this story in his presentation, the way in which we might have lost that kind of personal voice of discourse of the actual act of research, the moment of research, and what happens in that. We call this in eco-criticism narrative scholarship. That is, embedding your scholarship in the place where you are and in the crises, the senses, the debates that are exactly where you are located as you're doing that reading and thinking and reflecting and writing the poems and the articles. Do those two things occur together? This presentation raises a question for me. And what about the role of the Welsh language there? Isn't that, I don't know what I was actually seeing on the screen or hearing as you said that. I'm not entirely sure. What's the role of that play with language? I've talked about discourses, but what about the actual language that was going on there? What difference did it make hearing voices coming out of the audience? I was really struck with that when I first heard it, and I mentioned it to you. Fantastic, a voice coming out of the audience and not from the speakers themselves. I wonder what was going on there for us. What about the gendered aspect of this? Queens of War are three crows, ghosts of another time, and then that metamorphosis, the girl with the beak. So the gendered aspects actually are changed somehow by metamorphosis. And finally, I really don't want to ignore the fact that we've been experiencing drawing and not just talk, language. And what were the qualities of these drawings that contributed to what's been happening in the room now? So I raised some questions for discussion now. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Terry. Yeah, terrific. Well, we've got heaps of time for discussion. Who would like to kick off? Questions or comments? Penny.
I have a question. It's not formulated, but it's an immediate response to both the presentation and your response. And it's connected with what you just said about how you think through theory and how you express your ideas through drawing, writing and poetry and visual and all of those modalities. And then what is the relationship to something like new materialism? So it's a bit of a big question, but I need it answered. Iain.
Oh yes.
You put me on the spot about 20 years ago. In the same way.
Okay, fair enough. Define what you mean by new materials.
No. That was part of my PhD moment. No.
Okay. I take new materialism to be an attempt to break down hierarchies. About 8 years ago, Vice-Chancellor of Aberdeen University said that universities are no longer fit for purpose for 2 reasons. Firstly, because they've become some of the most archaic institutions in our society, and secondly, because they remain locked into disciplinary hierarchies, which puts philosophy as the queen of the sciences at the top, and everybody else can scrabble for their rung of the ladder further down. I was a little taken aback to read the Vice-Chancellor being quite so forthright, but I think what he is saying comes out of the same place as New Materialism, and my much more humble way of addressing this is to talk about a conversational aesthetic. And I think that what... Where's she going?
Sitting on your shoulder.
Back up. Why Erin and I wanted to work together was because we had kind of fallen into a conversation about deep mapping, which of course includes pretty much everything if you have the conversation for long enough. So it seemed a perfect way of, this collaboration seemed a perfect way of exploring that conversational aesthetic, and we both happen to like crows. So crows were as good a place to start as any. Obviously, crows are an excuse that takes us flying all over the place. Do you have anything to add to all this?
I still can't remember how we got to crows. That when we had a conversation about everything to do with deep mapping that we could fit into the time, and then I think one of us made a passing comment. You talked about high roads and low roads, and we talked about, yes, the academic high road and the academic low road, and also how that when you're writing or you're creating, it's like the air goes thinner and you're climbing a mountain. The more you get inside something, you're taking that higher road when you're creating, and then you come back down again. And when you look at it from the valley, you go, oh, couldn't do that today. And so when we're doing these creations, whether we're artists or painters or academics or whatever, we're going from the high road back down to the low road again. And I think that took us to crows. But conversation aesthetic, yes, absolutely. I mean, your response there, I mean, you've summed up my entire career, that's what I do. I was like, oh, my obituary's just been read out. You know what I mean? Absolutely. And the Ruth element, what was amusing was, as I turned my phone off, I got an email from Ruth, who doesn't know we're here, who was just sending me a video of a film she just did down on the beach in Newgale that I was involved in, where we were a flock of birds. And there were about 170 of us being a flock of birds on Newgale Beach. And she properly sent me that footage as I turned the phone off. So I think the next thing we do, we need to include Ruth as well, because she keeps turning up.
The reason I wanted to include that, apart from that it's obviously appropriate in terms of the crow child.
Iain, do you want to, if you, want to,
yes.
You can stay on your chair if you want to, but come around so that you can have your back to people.
Is that I was certainly led to believe that the world is defined by rational thought, by the laws of science, if you like, and so on and so forth. But I referred very briefly to my father's stories about Skye when he was a child. When he was a young man, he took a climb with a local man over the Coolin. If any of you know the Coolin, they are the most difficult mountains in the UK. They are very tricky. They got to the other side, and my dad said to this guy, "Oh great, we can go that way and we can stop at the hotel and have a dram. And he said, nope, I'm going back. And my dad said to him, what do you mean you're going back? This is about 6:30, lights starting to go. He says, I'll go back the way we came. My dad said to him, why on earth would you do that? He said, I'm not passing them standing, wrong accent, I'm not passing those standing stones, which were 2 miles down the road. He would rather climb back over the Coolin in the dark than pass that place after dark. When you're told stories like that and you're a kid, you start to think, okay, I may not believe that, but if somebody else believes that to the point of being prepared to do something to most people's mind as bloody stupid as that, one has to respect that. And my dad had a whole series of stories like that which he told endlessly, and because I've heard them so many times I don't want to bore you with them. But what that gave me was a sense, not that I believe in the supernatural or I believe in any of those things, but simply that I should remain agnostic. And again, I think part of the fun of doing this has been playing with our various agnosticisms, allowing them out for a little bit of exercise and a run around.
Can I contribute to this conversation as well, actually? Because, of course, I mean, one of the hierarchies that new materialism breaks down, I mean, particularly if you look at the work of physicist Karen Barrard, is the kind of hard and fast hierarchy, so even the barrier between the animate and the animate. And I mean, a truly scientific attitude accepts that scientific knowledge is always partial and incomplete, and therefore there are many things beyond what science can yet prove. Otherwise, it would be scientistic ideology, only that which science at this particular moment. I mean, how arrogant is that? And how stupid is that? But true scientists recognise that it's always just partial and provisional. There's a hell of a lot that we don't understand, and in fact, you know, as you know, recent physics has actually disclosed that the material world is far more dynamic, agentic, and amazing, you know, than had been assumed by classical physics. But our normal, everyday Western, Euro-Western mindset is stuck in the old physics. It's stuck in 17th century physics. We'll never get beyond modernity if that's what we want to do. If there are problems with modernity, if we're stuck in a modernist metaphysics, which is basically a reductionist, materialist metaphysics. So the new materialism, drawing on science, shows us, in fact, that the material world is much more mysterious than we assumed. And in fact, for some very rational thinkers, such as the Australian philosopher Bart Plumwood and Janet and my friend Deborah Birdrose, who has spent many years working with Aboriginal people, it's completely plausible to adopt a position of philosophical animism. So I don't think you need to be embarrassed about acknowledging animist potentialities. And Freya Matthews would also have a response to your another Australian eco-philosopher, would have a way of understanding your experience with the, you know, the crow kind of. The way that crow things are kind of congregating around your work. You should be careful what you're invoking when getting into crows. Absolutely. The classic trickster. And that's interesting too, that the crow is a trickster across several cultures. There may be something in that.
Thank you for that. That was such a wonderful performance. I really enjoyed it. I just have a question, kind of riffing off of all of those things about that kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary aspect, about whether or not you've looked into current research about COVID communication or anything, because there's so much coming out in terms of how they actually have different languages within certain communities, how they recognise faces across different spaces, and even and they can actually inform one another of faces to avoid, because that's the nasty guy, don't dive bomb him, or do something else. But in terms of whether or not you can maybe embed some of that into this project, so I think it's such an interesting way to focus through folklore, and I've got a lot. I used to teach the Ballad of the Twa Corbies at Glasgow. Personal favourite of mine. I've heard various different iterations, but how maybe that sense of folklore identity of the crow can change in relationship to the crow's own sense of kith, in terms of how we're starting to understand that they do have that sensibility, they have an understanding of community that is different to what we might have perhaps considered it to be previously, and how that might shape this story as it goes forward.
Can I respond to that?
Yes,
Ian doesn't know this yet, but I'm part way through writing a second part to the poem called Blame It on the Raven, which is from the perspective of the corvid, which includes all of that. It includes the current new policy to cull ravens in Scotland. It includes trapping crows, all the various atrocities that we've done and are doing and are planning to start doing again for no scientific purpose that I can fathom at the moment, combined with the relationship with the pair of ravens I have at home, which is the exact opposite of that, in that I go out into the field and my cat, who actually is the model for all these pictures of the crow, is actually my cat, and she comes out and sits on my shoulder, and the raven comes and joins, and she yowls and the raven calls back, and there's a piece in process as we speak, doing exactly what you said. I just want to add in, all my work is based on Karen Bard's new materialism.
Right, yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah. I was kind of picking up the right kind of
yes.
subtext there.
And Ian's agnosticism, I think, why we work so well, really, generally when we're doing things, is that I'm working with beliefs, not agnosticisms. So I make my living as a scientist. I work in geoscience. And then I also work as a poet and an artist, and they're all different belief sets, and the fragmentary belief sets that they're not in tension with one another. So we had that lovely fit.
I think that the challenge is now the other way round for us in humanities.
Yes.
The opposite really of Ted Hughes's observation.
Yes.
Is how we in the humanities as environmental humanists actually incorporate data and scientific information inside artworks, inside art speech. And I think that's come to a crisis in climate change engagement, where we all need to know more and pay attention to the difference between 1.5 meters sea level rise and 2 meters sea level rise, the difference between 2 degrees global warming increase and 3 degrees. Those crucial bits of data are very difficult to engage with in art speech, as it were, as opposed to commentary, as opposed to footnotes, you know what I mean? And I think that's a bigger challenge now. And what are the limits of eco-poetry engaging with these things while still being poetry?
Oh, can I get back to you in 3 years when I finish my next project?
Just.
You agree it's a challenge?
I absolutely agree, and I am just about to engage in a 3-year project doing that, and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
But I think I say this with some hesitation. I think you may be framing the problem in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with, because what makes it possible to do something like this is that we also compare cats, talk about our children, worry about all those very mundane, everyday things, and that goes into the mix. I've just been in Ireland, and I was asked to present present my work digitally via a PowerPoint, and I began by making a list of all the things that all the people who know me might think of as being my work. I had to edit it because it was far too long. And I think the difficulty is that we want interdisciplinarity, but we forget that interdisciplinarity is still framed within the presuppositions of the disciplinary. And it's only when, I mean, this is what the chorus does, if you like. The chorus represents every person. The chorus is not the academic at the front of the room. And I think that it will be very difficult to move from the various exclusivities that surround us, whether that's in the arts, in the academy, wherever it is, until we have, it's back to flatter hierarchies, it's back to a more horizontal thinking, speaking, acting that is more inclusive. There's a wonderful book called Everyday Aesthetics, which I would recommend to everybody, because it reminds us that although there's nothing wrong with high aesthetics, if you like, it tends to be used as a tool of social exclusion or as a tool for making money, which very often comes to the same thing. And the aesthetic is everywhere. The aesthetic is, and until we enlarge our sense of the aesthetic, we can't draw in the numbers of people we need to draw in to participate in the kinds of discussions, conversations, arguments vital to vital to everything in many ways.
And this is why we need interdisciplinary scholars, because otherwise we lose our boundaries and we lose our edges when we have these conversations. And we need edges. We need expertise. We don't want to turn everything into grey paint water. So you need people who can translate, who can recognise that a scientist's view of art is going to be different to a literary scholar's view of the same piece of art, and aren't going to diminish those individuals' perspectives by reducing them. So you have to acknowledge those expertise and almost sharpen the edges and just not be afraid to step over them.
I think what we need is responsible trespass.
Yes.
We talk about disciplinary fields. What we need are responsible trespassers. People who know that you don't walk straight across the middle and flatten the crops or scour the cows or whatever it may be, but who are not afraid to just hop over the wall and walk around the edge and have a good look at what's in the next field.
And that's what the girl in the poem is saying, that she's made of thinking. She flies higher. So, we've got the low road, we've got the mountain road, and then we've got the crow. And the crow is flying higher than both of those. And so can see the walls that still exist, however high we climb up. The crow can see even higher than that. And once you're above them, they make more sense. You understand why the boundaries are where they are. They suddenly form a topographical logic. And I think disciplines are like that as well. And we're in danger with interdisciplinarity of being a bit sniffy about people staying within their groups. And also of thinking that if you just put two side by side, that's interdisciplinary thinking. And it so isn't. And I have so much of this within geoscience and climate change communication, where the thought is, we'll just bring a musician in and, and we'll run that parallel with our science talk. And there's no conversation going on. And they're often big, shiny, fancy exhibitions, big concerts and wonderful publications. And there's no soul.
I think that word is so interesting because this is more a kind of an attempt to try and get a little bit high, but not as high as the crow. Is that I've been grappling with, sorry to bring a certain person into the room, sorry, cringing, we're still looking at Joseph Boyce's work. And so he was very influenced by Steiner, and that idea that actually you have to learn to perceive the material and the inner life, how you respond to the crow or how you respond, and you have to see things in an expanded sense. If not, we will go under. You know, we effectively, Boyce could already see that if we didn't kind of become more astute and see things in an expanded way, which included the animated side of things, that we would, our scientific perspective would take us under. But in New Materialism, I found an interesting way of looking at that work. But in New Materialism, I haven't yet found a sense of how that affects the inner life. So I found a very keen sense of the animistic and an the way materials are agentive and so on. It's almost like it just really hit me when you said, how do we put the scientific facts into the art to then convey them in a vehicle? And it's almost, that seems almost like a really bizarre procedure from this perspective. And I suppose it's more, I can see that the challenge for artists is to try and make something that seems distant, more imminent and more, something that you have to act on. But actually, it's maybe more an inward-out movement than a plonking. And I don't know, so I'm just grasping a little bit at kind of a sense of trying to make sense of a strategy that might make people's inner lives engage with their environment, wake up, rather than trying to enlist, to set between themselves and their responsibility in themselves, rather than trying to get an artist to kind of tell the facts of the situation. Sorry, that's a little...
Owen, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, Vanta Black, people familiar with that? Some people will be, I guess. It's a new paint invented for space telescope purposes, but it's much, much blacker than anybody ever imagined you could get black paint, and it's very controversial in a number of ways, like ownership of it and stuff. But the aesthetics of black is really fundamental, isn't it, in this? I can name dozens of pop songs and bands that are about crows and black feathers and blah. You just don't get the same about pigeons. You get a few songs about pigeons. You don't get the same about rats. And crows occupy this amazing position of being, in a way, common pest animals which are shot, but also highly glamorous and highly poetically charged. And I just looking at the screen, which is framed in black, and that must be part of this story. And what is the relationship? Black cats and witches' cats and stuff like that. What is the relationship between blackness, crows, and which way around is the story going and stuff like that?
But then you've got jays, and you've got hoodie crows, black and white, and then the jackdaw is silver, and the raven in the sunlight is blue. Always reminds me of Kali Ma. So Sara Kali in Roma comes from Kali Ma in Calcutta, and she is the night sky. And we see in English this has become black, but actually in Sanskrit and in Kalderash with Roma it's blue. And it's not black, and the darkest colour is blue because it's the night sky.
I think this is really interesting because one of the interesting things you learn when you start trying to paint is that colours have no absolute and fixed quality. Because as soon as you put one colour next to another colour, it changes. And somehow that seems very pertinent in this context. And again, it goes back to that idea of conversation. Like, if I put an idea into a conversation, if the other person is actually listening and not just thinking of what they're going to say next while I'm speaking, which of course is what happens a lot of the time in conversation, there is a slight adjustment to the way that they think. There has to be, and it is like putting one colour next to another colour, so that what looked like a black put next to a dark orange, suddenly its blue appears. And maybe that's how our thinking changes. It comes from positioning things next to what we would call complementary colours, but maybe are complementary ideas, so that something else appears.
Yeah, I'm trying to listen.
I wasn't having a go at you.
No, it's fine.
Absolutely not.
No. Yeah. I mean, ravens are pretty startling things for sure, and then you have to whole differentiation of different types of corvids, I suppose. But yeah, I still think that blackness is pretty fundamental to the whole thing. You're wearing black. But.
I always do.
I felt we had to make a gesture towards the crow.
That's why I came back.
And of course, all crows wear braces.
Do you pass the drawings around?
That's about the relationship with, say, how you developed the poem and the drawings, and were they done at the same time, the drawings and the illustration, or can you talk a bit about that process of practice?
24 hours of madness. Yes, Iain wrote the prose and sent me the prose with a whole host of photographs, images, album covers, ideas, reference points, just a fantastic, this is what I was thinking about visually, and these are the words that came with it. And I systematically removed every single image that he included. Bar the one. And
this is what collaboration is about.
yeah, it's about hurting. Hurting another person and being hurt back and going, yeah, that's okay, that works. Because now I'm stretched a bit more. So I went through them all, and I'd written the first verse of the poem. That was the first thing we did, wasn't it? Wrote the first verse of the poem and the image that's in the abstract advert. Then Iain wrote the text and sent me the text with this mishmash of information, visual information. And I thought, oh, that's useful. I'm getting more information from his visual content than from the text, but I'm understanding the text more. I need to keep that, but I need to refine it somehow. So I only had that first verse, so I just wrote a bit more and then took an image and drew that image, and then wrote some more and drew another image, and then read some text and drew another image and wrote some more. And the whole thing took about 24 hours. Just warmed through the notes, how I write anyway. I just warmed drawing and rewriting, drawing and rewriting. When I write poetry, I very rarely edit. The editing's done in my head, or time it goes down on the paper, it's finished. I might tweak the odd word, but it's complete. Even King of the Sea Trees, which is 2,000 words long, was complete when it went down. I had it, could feel it, like a piece of music. It's there, ready to go, bang, right.
And as you're drawing, are you thinking about what you're doing?
Drawing, I have no idea what's happening when I'm drawing.
So is that like a pause, or is that how does that?
No idea. Absolutely not got a clue. It's like a little holiday. I put the pen to paper and I don't know what's going to happen. And then I go, oh, hello. Oh, where are you going? And I draw another one. And Iain's talking about his relationship with his father, having influenced some of this. My father was an artist, and my mother was a musician and a Montessori teacher. So I grew up with Montessori and Steiner thinking in the household. My father's also Irish, and could make anything. And to keep me occupied, he'd give me all the oil paints and the watercolour paints, and to explore how the colours changed when you put them next to each other and when you mix them. Iain does not know this, but this was how I spent my early years, and he taught me to draw and loved to take hues. So, and I was born in 73, so by that point, Crow was out. So I was here, that was very different upbringing but it then comes through in this amalgamation of work. Even now when I write academic papers, I draw as well. So there's always cartoons and illustrations in them, including one of imagination in the dock being harangued by Sir Science with his hammer, and imagination shackled in front of her, which is one of the ones that I redrew this morning for Rowledge.
Don't ever sit next to Erin at a conference, because you spend all your time looking at these extraordinary doodles emerging and lose the thread. And if you sit next to me, you get drawn.
So it's just a process. For me, it's thinking. So the drawing is the thinking. So a poem is a series of images and feelings. That inner life that you're talking about is, for me, that's a poem. And poetry encompasses that abstraction without tying it to the ground too much. And Welsh does that particularly well. So that the Welsh verse that you referred to, it makes allusions that you can't do in English, because it's playing with the word landscape. So there's two different words for landscape with slightly different meanings. And it's playing with habitat and imagination. And all it's essentially saying is they went for a walk and they each saw a different place.
Were you aware when you put the Welsh up that it actually changed the drawing?
Yes.
I was very struck by it.
Will you tell us about it? I mean, it's never going to be a direct translation, but...
Now that's kind of, that's sort of it. They go for a walk in the land and the landscape, and they see the habitat that's in their imagination.
But the place actually, in the image that you have up there, you've got the English and we see the drawing, and then you have the Welsh, and it's a different place. It's actually different.
Yeah, it moves from Yorkshire to Wales.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, actually, I'm got to take a different walk. And use some of the words in the Welsh. I've got to walk differently in that.
Yeah, I've got to walk differently now.
Yeah. And in a way, if I can just add something, this goes back to your point about the inner life. That the words we use cut us off from the inner life. And I was very interested in what you were saying and in the way that you were saying it, because I thought some of those words are going to make it harder to reach the inner life through the materialist practice than some other words. And Steiner said something about translation, which is something to do with the fact that translation is understanding. Understanding, you don't need to translate, you need to understand. It's a bit like what you were saying about the expanding thing. I can't get that image out of my mind now, because there was the English and there was the Welsh and there was a different place.
And that's the whole, because we were writing about, Ireland, where, my family from, and Iain spends a huge amount of time, and Scotland, where I used to live, and Iain's family from, and then Yorkshire and Wales, where we both work. And so there were these four distinct landscapes shared that were coming through then in the drawing and the writing. So you've got those references. I drew the line at singing. But we did consider it. Did consider including a harp at one point, and I was thinking, I actually only have so many hands. But we did consider bringing that element in to make the places change.
And that would change it. So
it would change it again.
Yeah. I mean, what you were saying then, Sue, and also what Iain was saying about colour, is that things are what they are in and through their relations with other things, which is also a central kind of aspect of new materialism, what Barrard calls interaction.
Yes.
So things are altered through their interactions. You bring two things together and each is going to be altered. And this is the same with a kind of alive interdisciplinarity as well, that there will be a kind of transformation in that conversation. And indeed, with any true conversation, hopefully, one doesn't leave it quite the same. But Axel, you wanted to contribute when we talk about colours.
I don't know how much Irish you know, but the word for a black man is fargorol, so a blue man, really. So black and blue. So,
that's interesting.
But I've been fascinated by the presentation. I loved it, and I've been thinking mainly about the metamorphosis and the sort of shamanistic relationship between writers and birds. And of course in German culture, which is my area, Kafka is the key example, because it's a Czech word for jackdaw, and he identified with the jackdaw.
I should say Axel Goodbody is another recently appointed fellow of the centre. So welcome, Axel, in your new capacity.
This interesting thing about the inner life and the outer life. I find it puzzling because I think I've spent a long time reading a man called James Hillman, who basically decided that the way in which 2,000 years plus of monotheism has framed our thinking is unhelpful in various respects. And he suggests instead that we think more plurally, and there are people like A. David Napier who talks about polytheism not as a religious position, but as a way of understanding the world. And it seems to me that one of the questions that I was asking myself when we were working on this was, who is speaking? I speak from my own experience, but in speaking from my own experience, my father is speaking. I learnt much of what I understand about landscape. My father used to cull roe deer for the Forestry Commission because the roe deer eat the young trees and cause the Forestry Commission a great deal of distress. And he used to take me out with him. We very often didn't shoot anything, but we had a fascinating time worrying about where the wind was blowing from, listening, minding that we didn't step on adders that had come out to warm up in the morning sun. All those things, and I cannot go into certain kinds of landscape without falling back into a whole set of habits that are absolutely my father's habits. So who am I when I'm in that landscape? So this idea that I have an interior life that is not communal, that is not somehow itself a conversation, seems to me very strange. And I think that, you know, I have a great affection for our cat, and I spend a lot of time talking to our cat, who obviously ignores me as the way that cats do. You know, that's what they're there for, almost. My cat is part of my inner life, in those terms. But, so this idea that there is an inner life and an outer life seems to me it may be one of the things that stops us being more empathetic to the richness and complexity of the world.
Isn't your cat also black?
My cat is also black, but that's neither here nor there. Actually, he's kind of ginger in the sun. So
I think maybe by inner life I was more talking, and actually it kind of comes back to colour theory in a way. So that's quite a good example. So with Newton's idea of light as being something that is just light rays that come to the eyes and then you see them. Whereas for Goethe, there's something going on inside. You're within a context. You're not an alien that's landed, and so there's going to be an after effect response, or you know, there's going to be colour is not this sort of thing that just kind of goes to a receiver and then is perceived. So it's more, rather than it being like one's monologue, an internal kind of monologue formed by one singular voice. It's more that sense of that you affect the field, really, that you. You know, you are part of the shaping of things. So I don't know, that's a very...
That's why I put that particular image up, because you've got is the inner life the crow, or is the inner life the girl? Because if the girl and the crow are connecting, but then in the girl connecting with that crow, she's connecting with all crows. And the crows are connecting with a different perspective of the landscape, and they're connecting, of course, with the ravens and the jackdaws and the jays and the buzzards who hate the crows. And so you've got this relationship that's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So that picture looks like it's just her being isolated, but actually they've connected air and land in an expanded way, just by opening up that inner two-way voice.
I think.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what I would take from that is that our inner life is as social as our outer life, and it's a kind of. That's important because we're unlikely to sort out a lot of our environmental problems until we sort out a lot of our problems about injustice and so on and so forth. And so it's important not to, this is back to disciplinarity, this is back to walls, this is back to all those problems of divide and rule would be the kind of crude way of putting it. It's not about dissolving differences, but it is about being able to move between them. And if we don't feel free to respect the voices of the dead, the voices of whatever, the presence of animals, whatever it may be, within what we call our inner life, then we become very isolated and miserable, I think.
It is respect, that's all any of it comes down to, really. If we had a culture of respect within the academy, we wouldn't be having this conversation now, because it wouldn't be necessary, because we wouldn't say have created a society in which science is up here.
Yeah, and what would the academy be in that society? I mean, it would just be storytelling, it would be information exchange. It struck me when you were talking about who are you and your father's voice and perceptions as you walk around a familiar landscape to him, is what Aboriginal people, Indigenous people have, isn't it? It's that dialogue with the elders and their stories and the meanings and the empowerments of what that means.
I mean, that's my daughter.
So it's not isolating that, it's reverberating with all of those stories of metamorphosis that make meaning out of that. And I think that's why the Academy is trying to draw all these things together through reading and conversation. But all of this would have been taking place around fires.
But hang on a minute, so it's not the Academy just, it's modernity, so many universities will have cool things like this going on, where they've got huge great science departments going in exactly the same direction they've been going the last 300 years. So this is minority speak, which is trying to go somewhere else, but in a very, from a very difficult and small starting point, really. And the Academy is just a manifestation of the bigger society, of the industrial complex, the political concept, the theologies that underpin everything, the modern theologies and stuff like that. That's what we're talking about, really.
Yes, but we're in environmental humanities, and we're in environmental humanities because we're confronting a crisis.
Yeah,
and so minority speak is where we start from.
Yeah.
But I agree, minority speak needs to engage with the structures that we're all in. But this is the structure that we're in that enables us to do it, isn't it? This room, this meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. But the universities are still part of the problem, rather than
absolutely.
So
but how many of you do field work of some kind?
What do you mean by field work?
Well, you do field work all the time. You go and wander about and look at waves.
That's not a field. Oh, I see.
It's a field. It's a field of energy. My point being, disciplines that teach their students, in part through field work, consciously or unconsciously grasp the difference between discursive and performative knowledge. And the biggest problem with the academy is that it is too hooked on discursive knowledge and too disrespectful of performative knowledge. And this has huge consequences. If you go to a village meeting where they're discussing a potential wind farm, very often the planners and the solicitor and whoever, the local authority people and the local people talk straight past each other. And they talk straight past each other because they have completely different conceptions of what constitutes authority. The people who had an education that is focused on discourse believe in knowledge, capital K. You don't get to be respected in the kind of hill farming communities that I'm familiar with by reading anything. You get respected because you are really good at performing the tasks that you have to perform. Now, this is a crude differentiation because obviously there's lots of things that we do that are performative. But I think rather than worry about the whole damn thing coming down on our heads, which on one level it clearly is, if we can unpick some of these differences, I mean, the great thing about working as an artist is that you have to do both things, or you don't have to, but most artists choose to. They choose to move back and forth between the world of discourse and the performative world. They make stuff and they read and think and argue about stuff. And that's one of our roles is as kind of translators, mediators, go-betweens. And I think one solution is just to get the students out doing more field work.
That's what it's supposed to be now.
Preferably in vile weather, so they have to be nice to each other, give each other toffees, lend each other towels, cook together, all those things, and it changes. I used to do this with my MA students, and it really does change things. It changes the way people think about the world.
I am genuinely supposed to be teaching students in fieldwork this week. I'm just not there today and tomorrow. But that process of going out, I mean, we do it all the time in archaeology because we are combining hard science, soft science, humanities, literature, and classics. We just predominantly pretend we're not. But that is actually what's going on, and you do see this transformation with the students, and then you see it with the staff in response to the students, and it's exciting every time. But I was at the planning meeting in December. To go back to your planning point, you used the keyword in there, authority, which takes me back to my keyword, respect. In that, who has the authority? Where's the authority gone? It has gone. Nobody actually has the authority anymore. So I was in this planning meeting, and we had planners, we had artists who wanted to create a 9-metre high bronze tree on a shoreline as a climate change statement. And we had the protesters, and we had the people who were for it. And then we had most of the people who were agnostic in the middle, just going, well, I've got genuine concerns that I want answering. And I'm not really bothered one way or another whether it goes up. I'm not invested, but I have questions. And the protesters forced the agnostic people to take a position, to pick an authority, either the authority of the community or the authority of the academics. And they flatly refused to have a conversation or to mediate the two spaces. And you had people speaking talking about climate change, environmental change, reclaimed flooding, etc., all of those spaces. A lot of these people had been involved in the Hydro Citizenship Project with me in that space. So we're pretty technically clued up. When it came down to it, all the authorities that came from official sources went out the window. And everybody listened to their person who claimed to know about that space. And that person knew absolutely nothing, had everything wrong. And we had 3 experts there who explained very politely what the actual facts were and said, if we can get permission in this SSSI, I'll dig you a hole and show you this, but I'll come back to the labs and I'll show you the evidence. They completely ignored the 3 scientists and went for their community person who had everything wrong. And we were there, we were in the space, so we've got all the relevant authorities. Who do you think has won in this conversation? You've got a £100,000 project, you've got planners, you've got local council, you've got the leading world academics in climate change, you had me, you had protesters, you had a lot of dogs, a few seagulls, and there were 2 crows that we got a photograph of who were watching the whole thing. Who do you think had the strongest authority in that space?
The people with money.
You'd have thought, wouldn't you? The community. The people who had all the facts wrong. Every single tiny detail was wrong.
So what was the
But
result?
they had the authority. At that juncture, the vote was, there were 10 people voting in the planning office and 1 abstained and went against it, and that was enough to throw the whole thing off. So at the moment it's going through appeal. And again, it's pretty equal between people who are for and people who are against. And it's stalemating again. And this is absolutely the meeting of dialogue of art and science, authority, split between the intellectuals
Do you think it's because there are
and the community. What came through was an almost a hatred of the intellectual authority. Anything that somebody who had a doctor or professor in front of, or contract with NRW or English Heritage or CADU or any of those titles, where 10 years ago that would have elevated these people to someone to be listened to, it did the opposite.
So that's really interesting. And this is one reason why we've got Trump. It's that anti-intellectualism, disrespect for science.
It was like listening to Trump, the Trump argument.
Brexit,
But I was going to mention Trump. I was a really early adopter of hating Trump because of the golf courses in Scotland. And in that situation, the community voice was absolutely bulldozed into the sand. So in different scenarios, different things play out.
And we tend to think, I went into this with a bias that was absolutely pro-community, because normally they get completely bulldozed. And in this instance, I was like, well, what have we got all these qualifications for? What have we done all this research for? Why have we just spent the last 18 months studying this space and collating all this information? We know this landscape from a scientific and geotechnical point of view. Nobody's going to listen
to it. I think we have to be careful, because it goes back to the connections between the environment and social justice.
Yes.
I think, there's a wonderful book which I think is called Hillbilly Elegy or Redneck Elegy. Anyway, it's written by a lawyer who grew up in the Appalachians and only by a miracle actually worked his way through and became a lawyer. So he speaks for, if you like, the constituency that voted in Trump. And when you read that book and you read the way in which those communities were absolutely abandoned to rot, it's not surprising that the voice of authority becomes the voice of the enemy. And the problem for us, I think, in part, is how do we reverse that? This is why I think the conversational, the horizontal that which is not solely invested in discourse in the disciplinary is so important. And we saw that with the hydrocephalus.
It went well in some instances, less well in others. And co-creation, long-term relationships, slow residency, all sorts of things are really important. And you know, it sounds really frustrating, but listening to that, you know, one part of the project failed, and that was to have a decent to build up a relationship with the community, which is just as important as understanding
and that's it, and that's sort of where I was heading with this.
Sorry, this is so brilliant, and I don't want to go, but I have 2 crows waiting for me. Bedtime.
I think we should also all have a drink imminently.
Can I say just one quick? Just struck me that, of course, it only struck me that of the story you were telling was about a child who crossed the boundary with the animal world and the dangers of so doing. And it struck me with that issue with the sensitive line when you're dealing with other disciplines, to walk that line carefully and with respect. And it's just that also, you know, trying to be the animal. And often those stories are told as precautionary, aren't they? They're cautionary tales.
If you read then just the poem on its own, it's quite different then to this, because it is just a story about a girl who's discovering, goes for a walk and discovers that.
The mother who says, I told you.
So the mother is there in the landscape, but she's never actually, her voice isn't present, but she's in the landscape. But yeah, it is a girl going out and discovering the process of metamorphosis.
So it's not saying not to have the dialogue, but also, as you said, to respect the edges too.
And that's exactly what didn't happen, as you said, in this project, the planning meeting I was at. That key conversation that needed to be had, and that dialogue that we're all having here and that we're talking about doing, didn't happen. And so the whole thing collapsed and everybody involved became miserable.
But I think you've really got to get to trying to understand why that didn't happen. You know, there is a really deep resentment to, you know, when Go said about, you know, well, we've had enough from experts, you know, that kind of, you know, it just resonated out, you know, and the you know, it's like that sort of idea of, you know, how do you mix up the facts and the science stuff, you know, that, you know, it feels to me that this kind of conversation just needs to, you know, it's about kind of understanding, you know, we are largely a white audience in here, you know, just understanding what that privilege is all about. And you know, so for people that haven't had access to the kinds of things that we've had access to, but have been, you know, patronised for years or abandoned, you know, that you kind of the sort of the aftermath of the miners' strike, you know, where whole swathes of the country were just abandoned, and you know, all of that kind of just breeds resentment. So, you know, and some of that, you know, we may find ourselves speaking to each other from some of that resentment.
Yes.
But as, you know, people in academic institutions, I think kind of really understanding what that privilege is all about and working that through.
But understanding that people with that privilege have also got that resentment.
Yeah, exactly.
And that you know, that is just so key.
Yeah.
So these individuals were white, middle-class, predominantly artists who actually, I've known a lot of them a long time, very comfortable and closeted environment, and what they were doing was desperately trying to hang on to that bubble. Just leave our bubble, do not touch our bubble. Nobody come into our bubble. And I looked at that bubble and went, yeah, okay, you keep your bubble, you need your bubble. And then this chap decides to walk straight through the bubble. Okay. And it didn't, to me, it didn't matter that their argument is flawed in every available direction. It was the fact that they felt strongly enough to have an argument. That was enough, I felt, to say, well, okay, you don't go there. The resentment was just, it's poisonous. And I think, well, that's about as safe a space as I could possibly imagine myself going into, and the poison that is in there takes me back to Ted Hughes's comment about the academy and the superiority of science. And is this what's come out of that now? That there's this uprising against it that is leading to Brexit and leading to Trump. And we in the environmental humanities were getting thrown about like flotsam in the middle of it. But it's an incredible energy. And it's
an effect. So if you look at the before the Second World War, it's how it's looking at the people who are channeling that effect and where it's going.
It's very powerful. We need to be riding that wave and using it. Yeah, because most people I'm seeing within academia are going against it and are trying to analyse the disagreements at best, or predominantly fighting against it. And I'm thinking, no, I would just step into it. It's let's jump in and see what, because we're not going to get rid of it by putting up an even bigger wall, Mr. Trump. Let's get into it. Let's get it out. This is an abscess. We've burst it. We better drain it.
This is the point Iain was making about horizontal engagement. Yeah.
Could I suggest that we continue our conversations with some wine?